Good evening, my sleepy friends. I hope today loosened its grip on you a little, and that the night feels calm where you are. Tonight we're drifting back to the Victorian era, to a time when scientists and physicians were only beginning to realize that the human body carried an invisible network of signals, quiet messages moving through the nervous system, shaping thought, motion, and feeling. If you're new here, you're always welcome to subscribe, leave a like, and share where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, let your jaw unclench, sink into your pillow, and let's begin. You settle into lamplight on an evening when rain touches the windows without urgency, and somewhere in the distance, Victorian England is mapping something it cannot see. This is not a story of sudden discovery, but of slow attention, of physicians and anatomists bent over candlelit tables, tracing invisible lines through the body, trying to understand how a thought becomes a movement, how pain travels, and how the self holds itself together through wires no thicker than thread. There was a time not so long ago when the nervous system had no name. The body moved, yes. The hand withdrew from heat. The eye blinked against dust. But the reason why, the silent architecture that connected sensation to response, remained hidden beneath skin and assumption, interpreted through philosophy more often than observation. In the 1800s, before Victoria took the throne, most physicians still worked within frameworks inherited from centuries past. The body was understood through humours, through balance, and through invisible forces that flowed and ebbed like tides. Nerves were known to exist, pale threads discovered during dissection, but their function remained speculative, their nature uncertain. Some believed they carried animal spirits, a kind of vital fluid that animated flesh. Others thought them hollow tubes through which sensation might flow like water through pipes. Still others saw them as simple chords, pulling and releasing like the strings of a marionette. You can imagine the difficulty. To study the nervous system is to study something that operates in darkness, that leaves no visible mark, that finishes its work before the eye can follow. A muscle contracts, and by the time you notice, the signal has already travelled, completed its task, and vanished. Pain arrives instantly, but the pathway it followed offers no trace, no map, no evidence of its journey. Early anatomists could dissect a body and find nerves easily enough, white filaments branching through tissue like roots through soil, but what those filaments did, how they communicated, and what language they spoke remained stubbornly out of reach. And so theories accumulated. In the 1700s, physicians debated whether nerves were solid or hollow, and whether they vibrated like strings or conducted like metal. Some argued that sensation moved upward toward the brain, while motion moved downward from it, two separate streams travelling the same channels. Others believed the brain itself was merely a cooling organ, a radiator for the blood, and that true sensation lived elsewhere, in the heart perhaps, or distributed throughout the body like weather. By the time Victorian England began its long conversation with the nervous system, much of this confusion had softened but not disappeared. The brain was now understood to matter, to govern, and to coordinate. Nerves were recognised as communicators of some kind, but the mechanism, the how, remained mostly guesswork. Physicians could observe outcomes. They could see that severing a nerve stopped movement in the limb below. They could watch reflexes occur, quick and automatic, beyond conscious control, but understanding why, understanding the process itself, required a kind of attention that the previous century had not yet cultivated. What changed in part was patience. Victorian science developed a willingness to observe without immediately concluding, to document without fully understanding, and to sit with uncertainty rather than rush toward explanation. This was not always intentional. Often it was simply the recognition that the nervous system would not reveal itself quickly, that it required slow accumulation of detail, repeated experiments, and endless notes taken in quiet rooms where the only sound was the scratch of pen on paper and the faint ticking of a pocket watch. Rain falls outside those rooms now, as it did then. You can almost hear it, soft, persistent, the kind of weather that makes indoor work feel purposeful. Somewhere in a London hospital, a young physician leans over a cadaver, tracing the path of the vagus nerve as it descends from the brainstem, branching toward the heart and lungs and stomach. He does not fully understand what he is seeing. He notes its route, its thickness, and its connections, but the function remains unclear. Does it carry sensation? Does it regulate breath? Does it connect thought to digestion? Or are these separate systems merely adjacent? He writes his observations carefully. He sketches what he sees. He does not yet know that he is contributing to a map that will take decades to complete, that his small notations will eventually join with hundreds of others to form a picture of communication so intricate and silent that even now, centuries later, it remains only partially understood. Before wires had meaning, the body was a mystery that moved. After, it became a mystery that spoke to itself in whispers no one could quite hear. The laboratories where Victorian physicians studied the nervous system were not places of noise or urgency. They were small rooms, often cold, lit by oil lamps or gas jets that hissed softly in the background. The work conducted there required steadiness, steady hands, steady breath, and steady attention over long hours. There were no sudden revelations, no moments when understanding arrived complete and whole. Instead, knowledge accumulated in fragments, each observation leading to questions rather than answers. You can picture these rooms. Wooden tables, their surfaces stained and scratched from years of use. Glass jars containing specimens preserved in alcohol, pale tissues floating in amber liquid. Microscopes, still relatively new, their brass fittings catching the light. Notebooks stacked in corners, filled with drawings and measurements and tentative conclusions that would later be revised or abandoned entirely. And always the specimens themselves, nerves carefully dissected from animals or human cadavers, laid out for examination, their structure visible but their function still largely opaque. Physicians work slowly. They had to. The nervous system does not perform for an audience. It operates in living bodies, responding to stimuli faster than the eye can follow, coordinating movement and sensation through processes that stop the moment life ends. To study it required inference and building understanding from indirect evidence, from what could be observed at the edges. Some researchers focused on anatomy, mapping the physical structure of nerves with increasing precision. They traced pathways through the spinal cord, identifying where different nerves entered and exited, noting how they branched and rejoined. They discovered that nerves were not uniform. Some were thick, some thin, some covered in protective sheaths, while others ran bare. They found that damage to specific areas produced predictable results. Injury to one region caused loss of movement, and injury to another caused loss of sensation, suggesting that different nerves carry different types of information. Others worked with living animals, conducting experiments that today would seem crude, but which at the time represented genuine attempts to understand function through careful observation. A researcher might stimulate a nerve with a mild electric current and watch what happened, which muscles contracted, how quickly, and whether the response varied with the strength of the stimulus. Or they might sever a nerve and observe the changes that followed, noting which functions disappeared and which remained intact. These experiments were not conducted casually. Victorian scientists, despite working in an era without modern ethical frameworks, generally approached such work with seriousness and restraint. The goal was understanding, not spectacle. The animals used were treated as sources of knowledge, and while the methods were sometimes uncomfortable to consider, they were employed with the recognition that the nervous system's secrets would not be revealed through thought alone. Rain continues outside, steady and soft. Inside, a researcher bends over a preparation, examining the junction where a nerve meets muscle tissue. He has noticed something curious. When he stimulates the nerve, the muscle contracts, but there seems to be a tiny delay, a gap in time too brief to measure accurately, but present nonetheless. This gap suggests that the nerve is not simply pulling the muscle like a rope, pulls a bell, but is instead communicating with it somehow, sending a message that the muscle then interprets and acts upon. He makes a note. He does not have the tools to pursue this observation further. The gap is too small, the process too fast. But he records it anyway, trusting that someone, someday, will return to this question with better instruments and clearer understanding. This is how Victorian neuroscience proceeded, through accumulation, through patience, through the recognition that individual researchers were contributing pieces to a puzzle that might not be completed in their lifetimes. Physicians corresponded with one another, sharing findings, debating interpretations, and building slowly toward consensus on certain points while remaining uncertain about others. Some questions seem to answer themselves through sheer repetition of observation. It became clear, for instance, that the spinal cord was not merely a cable connecting brain to body, but was itself capable of coordinating certain responses. Reflexes, the automatic withdrawal from pain, the knee jerk when struck below the kneecap, occurred even when the brain was not involved, suggesting that the spinal cord contained its own capacity for decision, its own local intelligence. Other questions remained stubbornly resistant to resolution. How did nerves actually transmit information? Was it through electricity, as some experiments suggested? Through chemical changes? Through mechanical vibration? Different researchers championed different theories, and the evidence seemed to support all of them partially while confirming none completely. And beneath these technical questions lay deeper, more unsettling uncertainties. If nerves were simply wires carrying signals, where did consciousness arise? Where did the thought happen? Where did the self live, if the body was merely a network of automatic responses coordinated by tissue that could be dissected and examined like any other organ? These were not questions that could be answered in quiet laboratories, but they were questions that arose there, that emerged from careful observation, that made the work feel less like cataloguing and more like approaching something profound and difficult to name. The rooms remain quiet. The rain continues. Somewhere, a physician closes his notebook for the evening, extinguishes his lamp, and walks home through wet streets, carrying with him observations that will not be fully understood for decades, questions that will outlive him, and the peculiar satisfaction that comes from knowing you have looked closely at something no one before you quite saw. The relationship between electricity and the nervous system began not with clarity, but with frogs. In the late 1700s, before Victoria's reign, an Italian physician named Luigi Galvani had noticed that dead frog legs would twitch when touched with metal during a thunderstorm. He believed he had discovered animal electricity, a vital force inherent to living tissue. Others disagreed, arguing that the electricity came from the metal, not the frog. The debate continued for decades, unresolved but suggestive, hinting that somehow, in some way, electricity and nerves were connected. By the Victorian era, this connection had become impossible to ignore, though its exact nature remained frustratingly unclear. Researchers found that they could stimulate nerves with electrical current and produce movement in the attached muscles. They could also detect electrical activity in living nerves, faint signals that seemed to accompany nervous function. But whether electricity was the language of nerves or merely a side effect of their operation, whether it was the message or just the noise, remained open to interpretation. You can imagine the experiments. A laboratory in the evening, gas lamps burning low. A researcher has prepared a nerve muscle preparation from a recently deceased animal, the nerve still attached to the muscle it once controlled. He touches the nerve with electrodes connected to a battery, sending a small current through the tissue. The muscle contracts immediately, then relaxes when the current stops. He repeats this dozens of times, varying the strength of the current, noting how the muscle responds. What he observes is consistent. Electrical stimulation produces movement, but this raises as many questions as it answers. Does this mean nerves naturally use electricity to communicate? Or has he simply found a way to artificially trigger a response that normally occurs through some other mechanism? The muscle contracts when stimulated electrically, yes, but it also contracts when he pinches the nerve mechanically or when he applies certain chemicals. Electricity works, but so do other things. What then is the actual language of nervous communication? Some researchers became convinced that electricity was fundamental. They pointed to the speed of nervous transmission, which seemed far too fast to be explained by fluid flow or mechanical vibration. They noted that electrical signals could travel along wires almost instantaneously, and suggested that nerves might operate on similar principles. They built increasingly sophisticated equipment to measure and record electrical activity in nervous tissue, documenting patterns and rhythms that seemed to correspond with function. Others remained skeptical. They noted that nerves, unlike metal wires, were wrapped in insulating sheaths that should prevent electrical conduction. They pointed out that electrical stimulation often produced effects different from natural nervous activity, more violent, less controlled, suggesting that electricity might activate nerves without actually replicating their normal operation. They argued for chemical theories instead, proposing that nerves released substances that triggered responses in muscles and other tissues. The truth, which would not become fully clear until well after the Victorian era ended, was that both groups were partially correct. Nervous transmission does involve electricity, but electricity of a peculiar kind, generated by the movement of charged particles across nerve cell membranes, travelling as a wave of chemical change that propagates along the nerve without requiring continuous external current. And at the junctions between nerves and other cells, the signal does become chemical, transmitted across tiny gaps by molecules released from the nerve ending. But the Victorians could not yet see this. They had pieces, electrical activity, chemical effects, mechanical responses, but lacked the framework to assemble those pieces into a coherent picture. And so they experimented, they debated, they published papers arguing for one interpretation or another, and slowly, through accumulation and argument, they narrowed the possibilities even as the fundamental mechanism remained obscure. Reflexes presented their own puzzle. Everyone agreed that reflexes existed, automatic responses that occurred without conscious thought or decision. Touch something hot and your hand withdraws before you consciously register the pain. Tap below the kneecap and the leg kicks forward without any intention to kick. These responses were fast, consistent, and clearly involved the nervous system. But how? Early theories suggested that reflexes were simply very well practiced voluntary movements, so habitual that they seemed automatic. But experiments quickly disproved this. Researchers found that reflexes persisted even when the spinal cord was severed from the brain, even when consciousness was absent, and even when all voluntary control had been lost. A decapitated frog, grim as this sounds, would still withdraw its leg from acid and still demonstrate the same reflexive responses it had shown while alive and intact. This was deeply unsettling to some Victorian thinkers. It suggested that large portions of the body's behaviour were not controlled by the will, not governed by conscious decision, but were instead automatic responses coordinated by the spinal cord and lower nervous centres. It made the body seem less unified, more like a collection of semi-independent systems that happened to coordinate under normal circumstances, but which could, under the right conditions, operate separately. The philosophical implications troubled many. If most of what the body did was automatic, where exactly did the self reside? If nerves could coordinate complex responses without consciousness, what distinguished conscious action from reflex? Was free will an illusion, or merely a thin layer of deliberate control floating atop a vast ocean of automatic processes? These questions could not be answered through dissection or electrical experiment. They belong to philosophy, to theology, to the murky territory where science and meaning intersected. And yet they arose directly from careful observation, from the slow realization that the nervous system was not simply a tool of the will, but was instead a complex hierarchy of control, with different levels operating according to different rules, some accessible to consciousness and others forever beyond it. Rain falls against the windows of a hospital ward. A physician sits beside a patient recovering from a spinal injury, observing how certain reflexes remain intact while voluntary movement has been lost. He notes the patterns carefully, adding to the growing catalogue of observations that will eventually reveal how different parts of the nervous system govern different functions. But tonight he simply records, aware that he is documenting something important without yet understanding what it means. The confusion was real. The certainty would come later, assembled from thousands of observations like these, gathered patiently across decades of quiet work. Pain was a problem. So were touch, temperature, and pressure, all the sensations that seemed simple and immediate, but which upon examination revealed themselves to be deeply mysterious. How did a pinprick on the fingertip become a feeling in the mind? How did information travel from skin to brain, and what happened along the way to transform physical stimulus into subjective experience? Victorian physicians knew that sensation required nerves. Sever the nerve to a limb, and all feeling in that limb disappeared. This much was clear, but the process itself, the transformation of touch into signal, signal into perception, remained largely invisible, accessible only through inference and careful testing. Some researchers focused on mapping. They touched different parts of the body with fine instruments, noting where sensation was acute and where it was dull, where two nearby touches could be distinguished, and where they blurred together into a single impression. They discovered that sensitivity varied enormously. The fingertips could detect incredibly fine detail and could distinguish between points only millimeters apart. The back, by contrast, was comparatively numb, unable to resolve touches separated by several centimeters. This mapping suggested that nerves were not uniformly distributed, that some areas of skin contained many sensory endings while others contained few. It also suggested that the brain devoted different amounts of processing capacity to different body regions, allocating more neural resources to areas that required fine discrimination and less to areas where precision mattered little. But mapping only described the distribution of sensation. It did not explain how sensation worked, how physical pressure on skin became electrical or chemical activity in nerves, how that activity travelled to the spinal cord and then to the brain, or how it was interpreted, recognised, and given meaning. Physicians noticed something strange about pain. Unlike touch or pressure, which seemed to be detected at the skin's surface, pain felt deeper, more diffuse, and harder to locate precisely. A pinprick hurt at the point of contact, yes, but the pain also seemed to radiate, to fill a region rather than remaining confined to a single spot. And pain persisted. Touch a surface and you feel it immediately, but lift your finger and the sensation stops. Injure tissue, and the pain continues long after the damage has occurred, sometimes for hours or days, as if the nervous system were continuing to report something even after the initial cause had been removed. This led to theories about pain being qualitatively different from other sensations, perhaps carried by different nerves or processed through different pathways. Some physicians proposed that pain was not a separate sense, but rather the result of overstimulation of normal sensory nerves, that any sensation, if intense enough, would become painful. Others argued that pain had its own dedicated channels, its own specialized receptors that responded specifically to tissue damage. Both theories had evidence to support them, and both had problems. The debate continued throughout the Victorian era and beyond, fueled by observations that seemed to support first one view and then the other, never quite settling into consensus. Temperature presented similar puzzles. The body could clearly detect heat and cold, but how? Were there separate sensors for warmth and coolness, or did a single type of receptor respond differently to different temperatures? Could temperature be detected directly, or was it inferred from changes in other sensations? Experiments suggested complexity. Touching the skin with a warm metal point produced a sensation of warmth, as expected, but touching it with certain chemicals also produced warmth, despite the chemical itself being room temperature. And sometimes, paradoxically, touching the skin with something very cold produced a brief sensation of burning heat before the coldness registered. These observations suggested that temperature sensation was not simple detection, but involved interpretation, that the nervous system was actively processing the incoming signals rather than passively reporting them. You can imagine a researcher sitting in a dimly lit room, systematically touching different parts of his own arm with metal points of varying temperatures, noting where he feels warmth and where coolness, and where the sensations are sharp and where they are vague. He is mapping his own nervous system, using his own perception as the instrument of measurement. It is slow work, subjective work, but it is work that reveals patterns, that shows how sensation is organized, how it varies across the body's surface, and how it changes with repeated stimulation. What these experiments revealed, gradually and incompletely, was that sensation was not a simple transmission of information from periphery to center. It was an active process involving filtering, interpretation, and modification at multiple levels. Signals from the skin did not travel directly to consciousness, but were processed first in the spinal cord, then in lower brain regions, then in higher centers, with each level potentially modifying the signal, amplifying some aspects while suppressing others. This meant that what you felt was not simply what was happening to your skin, but rather what your nervous system decided to report about what was happening to your skin. Most of the time, this distinction did not matter. The nervous system reported accurately, provided useful information, and allowed appropriate responses. But sometimes, in cases of phantom limb pain, where amputees felt sensation in limbs that no longer existed, or in chronic pain conditions where tissue damage had healed but pain persisted, the distinction became crucial, revealing that sensation was as much about the nervous system's interpretation as about the stimulus itself. The Victorians documented these puzzles without fully solving them. They observed phantom limbs and could offer no satisfactory explanation. They noted that pain could persist long after injury and proposed theories about nerve irritation or abnormal sensitivity. They mapped sensation across the body's surface and discovered patterns of organization that suggested deeper structures they could not yet see. And they worked with the awareness that what they were studying was not just a physical process, but the foundation of subjective experience. That understanding how nerves transmitted sensation was, in some sense, understanding how the physical world became knowable, how external reality entered the mind. Rain continues outside, steady and patient. Inside, physicians record observations that will not be fully understood for generations, contributing pieces to a puzzle that reveals itself slowly, like fog lifting from a landscape. First the nearest features, then the middle distance, with the horizon remaining obscure. The question that haunted Victorian neuroscience more than any other was this: where does thought happen? Everyone agreed the brain was involved somehow, but precisely how and to what extent remained uncertain. Was the brain merely an organ like any other, processing signals and coordinating responses? Or was it something more, the seat of consciousness, the location where physical processes became subjective experience? Dissection offered limited help. The brain could be removed, examined and sectioned, and its structures identified and named. The cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the various folds and regions that composed its mass, all could be catalogued, drawn, and compared across different species. But structure did not reveal function. A brain sitting in a jar of preserving fluid, however perfectly preserved, told you nothing about thought, nothing about awareness, and nothing about the experience of being a person. Physicians tried various approaches to this problem. Some studied patients who had suffered brain injuries, noting which functions were lost when different regions were damaged. A blow to the back of the head might cause vision problems. damage to the left side sometimes disrupted speech. Certain injuries left movement intact but destroyed memory, while others did the reverse. These observations suggested that different parts of the brain governed different functions, that the mind was not a unified whole but a collection of specialized systems working together. This was both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because it suggested the brain could be understood through the same methods used to study other organs, through observation, experimentation, and careful documentation. Unsettling because it implied that the self was not a single thing but a coalition, that what felt like unified consciousness was actually the coordinated activity of many separate processes, any of which could fail independently. Other physicians focused on mental illness, trying to understand how disorders of thought and emotion might reflect disorders of the nervous system. This was difficult work, complicated by the fact that Victorian understanding of mental illness was itself confused and often cruel. But some researchers approached the problem carefully, documenting symptoms, looking for patterns, and trying to distinguish between conditions that seem to have physical causes, brain tumours, infections, injuries, and those that did not, that seemed to arise from the mind itself. The question of whether mental illness was a disease of the brain or a disease of the mind troubled Victorian physicians deeply. If it was physical, then it should be treatable through physical means, surgery, medication, or rest. If it was mental, then what did that mean? How could a mind become ill if the mind was just what the brain did? And if the brain was healthy but the mind was not, did that mean consciousness could exist separately from nervous tissue, or merely that physicians did not yet understand what to look for? No clear answers emerged. Instead, there was debate, disagreement, and competing theories that each explained some observations while failing to account for others. Some physicians proposed that mental illness resulted from exhaustion of nervous energy, from overwork or excessive study or emotional strain that depleted the brain's capacity to function. Others suggested chemical imbalances, inherited weaknesses, or moral failings that had physical consequences. Today, with the benefit of later discoveries, it is easy to see how limited these theories were and how much they were shaped by the assumptions of their time. But they represented genuine attempts to understand suffering, to find physical explanations for experiences that seem to transcend the physical and to bridge the gap between brain and mind. You can imagine a physician in the 1860s sitting with a patient who describes hearing voices, seeing things that are not there, and believing impossible things with absolute conviction. The physician examines the patient carefully, finding no signs of injury or infection, no obvious abnormality that might explain the symptoms. He notes the patient's words, behavior, and emotional state. He considers possible diagnoses and possible treatments. He is aware that he is probably not helping, that his understanding is incomplete, and that the tools available to him are inadequate. But he continues anyway, documenting carefully, hoping that his observations might contribute to future understanding, even if they cannot provide present relief. This was the condition of Victorian neuroscience when confronting the mind. Aware of its importance, conscious of its limitations, and proceeding with humility born of repeated frustration. Some questions seem to resist any answer at all. How did physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? How did electrical and chemical activity become thoughts, feelings, and sensations? You could trace the pathway of a sensory signal from skin to spinal cord to brain, could identify the regions that process that signal, could even detect the electrical activity associated with processing. But at what point did that processing become an experience? At what moment did the physical become the mental? This was the hard problem, the question that divided materialists, who believed consciousness was simply what brains did, from dualists, who believed mind and body were separate substances that somehow interacted. Victorian physicians tended toward materialism by necessity. They were studying physical tissue, observing physical processes, and trying to build physical explanations. But the explanatory gap remained, the persistent feeling that even a complete understanding of the brain's physical workings would not fully explain what it felt like to be conscious. And so they continued, mapping the brain's regions, documenting injuries and their effects, studying mental illness, and trying to understand how thought and emotion and awareness arose from tissue that looked, under the microscope, like any other tissue. They made progress. They established that the brain was essential to consciousness, that different regions served different purposes, and that damage to nervous tissue could alter personality, memory, and perception. But the central mystery remained untouched, accessible to philosophy, but resistant to science. Rain falls steadily outside. Inside, a physician closes his case notes for the day, having examined 3 patients with brain injuries, 2 with mental disturbances, and 1 with epileptic seizures. He has documented everything carefully. He has proposed treatments, though he has little confidence they will help. He has contributed to the slow accumulation of knowledge that will eventually, long after his own death, begin to illuminate the relationship between brain and mind. For now, though, that relationship remains mostly dark, mapped only in outline, its true nature still obscured. While physicians studied the nervous system in laboratories and hospitals, ordinary Victorians lived their lives guided by processes they never consciously considered. Every moment of the day involved nervous activity: waking, dressing, walking, eating, working, resting, all coordinated by signals travelling faster than thought, maintaining balance, regulating breath, adjusting heart rate, and coordinating movement without requiring conscious attention. You can imagine a morning in Victorian London. Gas lamps are still burning as dawn approaches, and the city is beginning to stir. A factory worker wakes to the sound of footsteps in the flat above. The nervous system emerging from sleep through stages that involve complex changes in brain activity, shifts in breathing rate, and alterations in muscle tone. None of this requires conscious decision. The body wakes itself, guided by internal rhythms and external stimuli, the nervous system managing the transition from unconsciousness to awareness without any deliberate instruction. The worker rises, dresses, and navigates the narrow stairs down to the street. Each movement requires extraordinary coordination, maintaining balance, adjusting posture, and placing feet precisely on worn steps in dim light. The nervous system monitors body position constantly through sensors in muscles and joints, makes tiny adjustments to prevent falling, and coordinates dozens of muscles to produce smooth, purposeful movement. All of this happens automatically, beneath awareness, leaving consciousness free to focus on other things: the day ahead, breakfast, and the weather. Walking through morning streets involves navigation, obstacle avoidance, and social interaction, all requiring rapid processing of visual information, quick decisions about where to step, when to pause, and information and how to move through crowds. The nervous system manages this continuously, directing attention to relevant features while filtering out irrelevant detail. allowing fluid movement through complex environments without overwhelming the conscious mind with sensory data. At the factory, the work might be repetitive, operating machinery, assembling components, and monitoring processes. This kind of work relies heavily on learned patterns, on movements that have been practiced until they require minimal conscious guidance. The hands know what to do, the eyes know where to look, and the body settles into rhythms of action that feel almost automatic. This is the nervous system operating at high efficiency, using past experience to guide present action, freeing consciousness to wander while the body performs its tasks. But always beneath this routine, the nervous system is also monitoring for danger, for unexpected stimuli that might require immediate response. A sudden noise, a glimpse of movement, a change in temperature, any of these can trigger instant attention, can interrupt routine and redirect focus, and can initiate defensive responses before consciousness has fully registered the threat. This vigilance is constant, unconscious, and essential for survival in environments where danger might appear without warning. Mealtimes involve their own nervous processes. Hunger signals from the stomach, mediated by nerves and hormones, create the sensation of appetite. Eating activates taste receptors on the tongue, triggers salivation, and initiates swallowing, a complex sequence of coordinated movements that must occur in precise order to prevent choking. Digestion itself involves extensive nervous control, with the gut containing its own elaborate nervous network that operates largely independently of the brain, managing the movement of food, the secretion of digestive enzymes, and the absorption of nutrients. Victorian physicians were beginning to understand some of this. They knew the vagus nerve connected the brain to the digestive system. They had observed that certain injuries could affect digestion, and that some illnesses produced both nervous symptoms and digestive problems. But the full extent of nervous involvement in digestion, the intricate coordination required, the constant back and forth communication between gut and brain, remained mostly unknown. Evenings brought different challenges. Social interaction required interpreting facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language. All forms of communication that operated partly through conscious understanding and partly through automatic nervous processing. A smile triggered a different response than a frown, not because of conscious analysis, but because the nervous system had learned to associate certain patterns with certain meanings. Conversation required coordinating speech production, monitoring one's own words, processing incoming language, and formulating responses, all occurring simultaneously at speeds that conscious thought could never match. Sleep presented its own mystery. Everyone knew sleep was necessary, that without it the mind became confused and the body weakened. But what happened during sleep remained unclear. Victorian physicians observed that the body relaxed during sleep, that breathing became slower and more regular, and that consciousness seemed to fade away. But they also knew that sleep was not simply the absence of waking. Dreams occurred during sleep, suggesting ongoing mental activity. Sleepers changed position regularly, responding to discomfort without waking. The body continued its automatic functions, breathing, heart rate, and digestion without interruption. Some researchers studied sleep, documenting its stages and cycles, noting how sleep patterns changed with age and illness. They observed that different types of sleep seemed to serve different purposes, that deep sleep felt different from light sleep, and that the sleep of early night differed from the sleep of early morning. But the function of sleep, the reason it was necessary, and the processes that occurred during those unconscious hours, these remained speculative, accessible to theory, but resistant to proof. Throughout all of this, waking and working, eating and socializing, moving and resting, the nervous system operated continuously, coordinating thousands of processes simultaneously, maintaining stability while allowing flexibility, and managing both conscious actions and unconscious functions with equal attention. Victorian life depended absolutely on nervous function, yet most Victorians never thought about it, never considered the silent signals that made every moment possible. A clerk walking home through evening rain, mind occupied with tomorrow's tasks, relies on nervous processes he has never heard of. His eyes adjust to changing light without his awareness. His feet find their path automatically. His body maintains temperature against the cooling air. His lungs and heart adjust their rhythms to match the pace of walking. All of this happens beneath consciousness, managed by systems that evolved over millions of years to keep bodies alive and functioning in complex, changing environments. The rain continues, soft against cobblestones. Somewhere nearby, a physician finishes his evening rounds, having spent the day observing patients, documenting symptoms, and trying to understand how the nervous system governs health and disease. Tomorrow he will return to his studies, will add new observations to his notes, and will contribute another small piece to the growing understanding of how human beings maintain themselves and how the body coordinates its own existence without requiring constant conscious oversight. For now, though, the day ends. Lamps are extinguished. The city settles into night. And throughout London, thousands of nervous systems continue their work in darkness, managing sleep, maintaining life, and operating according to principles that Victorian science is only beginning to glimpse. By the end of the Victorian era, the nervous system had been transformed from mystery to outline. Not fully understood, that would require decades more, but outlined, sketched, its major structures identified, and its basic principles at least partially grasped. Physicians knew that nerves transmitted signals, that the brain coordinated function, and that the spinal cord managed reflexes. They understood that different parts of the brain governed different activities, that sensation and movement travelled separate pathways, and that consciousness involved the brain but could not be reduced to any single region or process. What they had created was a map, incomplete and sometimes inaccurate, but sufficient to guide further exploration. The map showed where attention should be focused, which questions seemed answerable, and which would require new tools and new perspectives. It provided a framework for understanding disease, for interpreting symptoms, and for attempting treatments that sometimes helped and sometimes did not, but that at least rested on observation rather than superstition. You can imagine those final Victorian years, the 1890s, when electricity was becoming common and telegraphs connected distant cities, and the idea of invisible signals travelling through wires had become familiar enough that nervous transmission no longer seemed quite so mysterious. Physicians could point to telegraph systems and say, the nervous system is something like that, networks of wires carrying coded messages, coordinating distant parts into unified function. It was not a perfect metaphor, but it was better than animal spirits, better than hollow tubes, and better than the vague vital forces that earlier generations had proposed. The map would be refined. Future discoveries would reveal that nerves worked through electrochemical means, that transmission involved both electrical propagation and chemical signalling, and that the nervous system was far more complex than Victorian physicians had imagined. But those discoveries would build on Victorian foundations, would extend the map rather than replace it, and would add detail to outlines that had been carefully drawn in quiet laboratories over decades of patient work. Some questions remained completely open. Consciousness still resisted explanation. Memory was poorly understood, recognized as essential but mysterious in its mechanisms. Emotion seemed to involve the nervous system, but also seemed to transcend it, to connect with aspects of experience that pure neuroscience could not quite reach. Mental illness continued to puzzle physicians, presenting symptoms that clearly involved the brain, but which did not correspond to any visible abnormality in nervous tissue. These gaps were acknowledged rather than hidden. Victorian science had learned to work with uncertainty, to recognize its own limits, and to distinguish between what it knew, what it suspected, and what it merely hoped. This intellectual humility, born of repeated failures and partial successes, may have been one of its most important achievements. The recognition that understanding would come slowly, that nature would reveal itself in its own time, and that patience was not just a virtue, but a necessity. Rain falls one last time outside a London hospital, tapping against windows as it has throughout this story. Inside, a physician sits at his desk, reviewing notes from the day. He has seen a patient with paralysis following spinal injury, another with seizures of unknown cause, and a third with pain that has no apparent source. He has examined them carefully, has documented their symptoms, and has prescribed treatments that may or may not help. He has contributed his observations to the larger project of understanding the nervous system, has added a few more details to the map, and has recognized patterns that others will later explain. He does not expect to solve these mysteries himself. He knows the work will continue long after his own death, that understanding will accumulate through generations of careful attention, and that each small observation matters even when its significance is not immediately clear. This is the legacy of Victorian neuroscience, not dramatic breakthroughs or revolutionary insights, but steady, patient, cumulative work that slowly transformed ignorance into knowledge. The nervous system they studied remains the nervous system we study now. The questions they asked are questions we still ask, refined and extended, but fundamentally continuous with their original formulations. The tools have improved. We can now see electrical activity in individual cells, can trace chemical signals across synapses, and can watch the living brain respond to stimuli in real time. But the underlying challenge is the same: to understand how physical tissue produces experience, how signals become sensation, and how coordination emerges from complexity. Modern neuroscience acknowledges its Victorian origins. The maps we use still bear names given by 19th century anatomists. The fundamental concepts, neuron, synapse, reflex, sensation, and motor control, were shaped during that era, defined through observations made in gas-lit laboratories by physicians who worked without computers or sophisticated imaging or molecular techniques, and who had only careful attention and systematic documentation and the willingness to pursue questions that might never be fully answered. Outside, the rain begins to ease, not stopping entirely, but softening, becoming quieter, allowing other sounds to emerge: distant voices, the settling of buildings, the faint noise of the city preparing for sleep. The work of understanding continues, as it always has, as it always will, moving forward incrementally through the attention of people willing to look closely at what others might overlook, to record carefully what they observe, and to build knowledge piece by patient piece. The Victorian nervous system was never completed, only sketched, but what a sketch it was. Detailed enough to guide surgery, to explain symptoms, and to suggest treatments. General enough to remain useful even as later discoveries added complexity and nuance. Humble enough to acknowledge its gaps, its uncertainties, and its provisional nature. That sketch endures. We have added to it, refined it, corrected some errors, and filled some gaps. But the outline remains, drawn in rain-soaked London during an era when patience was abundant and certainty was scarce, when physicians understood that the nervous system would reveal itself slowly, like dawn arriving through fog, showing first the nearest features and only gradually illuminating the full landscape. The work continues still, in laboratories far different from those Victorian rooms, but guided by the same fundamental curiosity, the same willingness to observe carefully and record honestly and build understanding slowly. The nervous system, mapped incompletely then and incompletely now, remains a territory worth exploring, a mystery worth pursuing, and a question worth asking, even when answers come slowly or not at all. Rain tapers to silence, lamps dim. The evening settles into stillness, and somewhere in that stillness the nervous system continues its work, coordinating, communicating, maintaining, connecting, operating according to principles that Victorian science began to outline and that we, inheritors of their patient work, continue to explore with tools they could not have imagined, but with methods they would recognize. Careful observation, systematic documentation, and the quiet persistence necessary to understand something that will not reveal itself quickly, that requires decades or centuries of attention, that offers its secrets only to those willing to look closely and wait patiently and work humbly toward understanding that is always partial, always provisional, always worth pursuing. The story ends where it began, in lamplight and rain, with quiet attention directed towards something invisible but essential, something that makes us who we are, but which remains, even now, only partially understood. The Victorians gave us the outline, the rest remains to be filled in, through work that continues today and will continue tomorrow. Guided by the same patient curiosity that motivated those 19th century physicians who sat in quiet rooms and looked carefully at what no one before them had quite seen, who documented what they observed, and who trusted that understanding, though slow to arrive, would eventually emerge from accumulated attention.
You carry something older than your name. Before there were cities or fires or words spoken in the dark, there were limbs, quiet extensions of a body learning to move through the world. What you lift, what carries you forward, and what steadies you when you pause. All of it comes from a history so long it has no edges. Long before anything resembled what you would recognize as an arm or a leg, there was only water and the slow drift of bodies through it. Limbs began not as tools or structures built for purpose, but as accidents of shape, small fins, paddles of cartilage and muscle that moved almost imperceptibly against currents. These early extensions had no awareness of what they would become. They simply existed, responding to pressure, to temperature, and to the faint pull of survival in an environment that asked only one thing: keep moving, or sink. The water held everything. It supported weight without effort and allowed motion without the burden of mass pressing down. A body could twist, glide, or hover in place with only the slightest flick of a tail, or the gentle sweep of something almost like a limb. There was no ground to meet, no surface to push against. The early ancestors of your arms and legs were shaped by this weightlessness, by the freedom of 3 dimensions, by a world that asked nothing of strength or endurance, but only the ability to adjust, to turn, to drift a little closer to food or away from danger. Then the water began to recede in some places. Not everywhere, and not quickly. But in shallow edges where rivers met shores, where tides pulled back twice each day, there appeared something new, the boundary between floating and falling. Bodies that had known only the suspension of water found themselves pressed against mud, against sand, against the terrible weight of their own mass. The fins that had moved so easily through open water now scraped against solid ground. They bent in ways they had never bent before. Some broke, some wore down, but some, over spans of time too long to imagine clearly, began to change. The bones inside these early limbs were small and numerous, like pebbles strung together. They flexed and shifted, allowing the body to push and drag itself a few lengths forward when the water grew too shallow to swim. This was not walking. It was barely any movement at all. But it was enough. Enough to reach deeper water again. Enough to survive when the tide left a body stranded in the heat and the open air. You inherit from this. The small bones in your wrists, your ankles, and your fingers and toes. They are the descendants of that early flexibility that need to bend and adjust against a surface that would not yield. Your limbs remember mud, even if you have never touched it. They remember the first terrible weight of a body unsupported by water, the first clumsy press of bone against earth. The air was different. It moved around a body instead of through it. It dried skin that had always been wet. It required breath in a new way, a pulling inward and pushing outward that had to happen again and again without pause. And the limbs, still learning what they were, had to adjust to this too. They had to hold a body upright long enough to breathe. They had to support weight, not for a moment, but for long stretches of time, hours, and then days, and then entire lives spent mostly out of water, only returning to it for relief or safety, or the old familiar suspension. The shoulders and hips began to shift. The joints that had once allowed only a sweeping motion, a paddling through water, started to rotate in new directions. They learned to bear weight from above, instead of moving against resistance from all sides. The muscles that had powered a tail through open ocean now anchored themselves differently, pulling and holding rather than simply pushing. This was not a decision. It was not planned. It happened because the bodies that could manage this new way of being survived, and those that could not did not. Your arms and legs carry this transition still. When you reach overhead, when you rotate your shoulder to look behind you, and when your hip allows you to step sideways or backward, or to kneel down close to the ground, you are using joints that were redesigned, slowly and without intention, for a world where weight mattered and where the pull of gravity never stopped. The early limbs were thick and short. They spread outward from the body like the legs of a lizard, keeping the torso low to the ground. This was stability. This was a way to move without toppling over, to keep the center of mass close to the surface that supported it. There was no grace in this movement, no efficiency. It was effortful and slow, but it worked. It allowed bodies to cross dry land, to find new water, and to escape the crowding and competition of the old places. For millions of years, this was enough. Limbs stayed short, stayed wide, and stayed close to the ground. They carried bodies that were still more comfortable in water than out of it, that returned to rivers and swamps and shallow seas whenever they could. The limbs did not change quickly because there was no need. The world moved slowly. Seasons passed. Generations lived and died. And the shape of a limb, the angle of a joint, and the length of a bone, all of this stayed mostly the same, shifting only in tiny increments, in changes so small that no single lifetime would ever notice. But the ground itself was changing. Forests grew taller, grasslands spread, deserts formed where there had been water. And the bodies that moved across these surfaces began to find that the old way of moving, the low and sprawling way, was not enough anymore. Distance mattered now. Endurance mattered. The ability to move for hours without stopping, to cover ground faster than the shift of seasons, and to go where food was, instead of waiting for food to come close. And so, the limbs began to lengthen. Not everywhere, not in every lineage, but in some, in the ancestors of creatures that would one day stand upright. The bones stretched, and the joints moved closer underneath the body, instead of splayed out to the sides. The center of mass lifted. The body rose up from the ground, and the limbs, for the first time, began to look like pillars instead of oars. This was the beginning of what you carry now. The bones in your legs, long and straight and strong, come from this slow lifting, this gradual rise from the mud and the sprawl. Your arms, though shorter, still carry the memory of when they too bore weight, when they helped push and pull a body forward before the legs learned to do all the carrying on their own. You come from water, but you were shaped by land. Your limbs are the record of that transition, evidence of a body that learned to hold itself upright in a world that offered no help, no suspension, no relief from the constant press of its own weight. Standing still is harder than it seems. Not the standing you do now, automatic and thoughtless, but the first standing. The earliest moments when a body lifted itself fully upright and discovered that staying that way required a kind of attention no ancestor had ever needed before. The limbs that had learned to push against the ground now had to learn to hold, to balance, and to distribute weight across joints that were never designed for this particular task. The feet came first, though they were not yet feet as you know them. They were flat and wide, with toes that spread like fingers, gripping the surface beneath them. The ankles were thick and strong, built to absorb the shock of a body that now fell with each step, landing its full mass onto a small surface over and over again. Walking upright was not smooth. It was controlled falling, a series of catches and recoveries, and a constant negotiation between momentum and balance. The knees learned to lock. This was essential. Without it, standing required every muscle to work constantly, holding the leg straight through pure effort. But when the knee learned to straighten fully, to rest bone on bone in a way that required no muscular effort at all, standing became something a body could do for hours. You can feel this now if you pay attention. the way your knees settle when you stand in one place, the way they hold you without tiring, without thought. This is not a small thing. This is the inheritance of bodies that needed to stand and watch, to stand and wait, to stand through long stretches of time when movement was not needed, but presence was. The hips widened. They had to. As the spine lengthened and the torso rose, the pelvis became the foundation for everything above it. It carried the weight of organs, of ribs, of a head that was growing heavier. As the brain inside it expanded, the hip joints themselves deepened, becoming sockets that held the thigh bone in place with a firmness that earlier joints had never required. This was stability, but it came with a cost. The hips lost some of their flexibility and some of their range of motion. They became anchors instead of pivots. Your lower back carries the memory of this change. The curve in your spine, the small hollow just above your hips, exists because the body had to balance a vertical stack of bones in a way that kept the center of mass stable. As without this curve, you would tip forward. You would have to lean back constantly to keep from falling. The curve is not a flaw. It is a solution worked out over so many generations that it feels now like it was always meant to be this way. But standing still was only part of what the limbs had to learn. They also had to learn to catch a body in motion, to stop it without collapsing, to absorb force and redirect it. When you walk, each step sends a shock up through your heel, through your ankle, your knee, and your hip. The bones flex slightly. The joints compress and release. The muscles fire in sequence, tightening and loosening in a rhythm so fast and so precise that you never notice it unless something goes wrong. This rhythm was not always there. Early walkers moved stiffly, with joints that did not absorb shock well, with muscles that had not yet learned the timing. Each step was jarring. Each landing was a small impact that rattled up through the skeleton. But over time, the body learned to soften the landing, to bend the knee just enough, to let the arch of the foot collapse and spring back, and to use the ankle as a hinge that gave a little with each step. Your feet are miracles of small adjustments. The bones inside them are numerous and tightly packed, connected by ligaments that stretch and hold, that allow just enough movement to adapt to uneven ground, but not so much that the foot becomes unstable. When you step on a stone, or a root, or a slope, your foot adjusts without your conscious instruction. It shifts weight, redistributes pressure, and finds balance in a fraction of a second. This is learned behavior, inherited across so many generations that it feels instinctive now, but it was not always so easy. The arms, no longer needed for walking, began to learn a different kind of weight-bearing. They became tools for lifting, for carrying, for holding things close to the body, or for pushing them away. The shoulders rotated in ways the hips could not, allowing the arms to reach in nearly every direction. This freedom came from the fact that the arms no longer supported the body's full weight. They were released from the burden of locomotion and given over to manipulation, to the careful work of shaping and holding and moving the world in smaller, more deliberate ways. But even the arms had to learn strength. Not the strength of motion, but the strength of stillness. Holding something heavy requires sustained effort, a kind of endurance that is different from walking or running. The muscles of the arms and shoulders learned to fire continuously, to hold tension without shaking, and to bear weight for minutes or hours when necessary. You feel this when you carry something awkward or heavy for too long, when your shoulders begin to ache, not from movement, but from the simple act of holding. The spine learned to compress and release with each breath. This is something you do constantly, without noticing. The slight rise and fall of your ribcage, the gentle flex of the vertebrae as air moves in and out. But this flexion also helps distribute weight. It allows the spine to act as a spring, absorbing some of the shock from walking, from standing, and from the constant press of gravity. The discs between each vertebra are soft and spongy, compressing when weight is applied and expanding again when the pressure is released. They wear down over time, becoming thinner and less flexible. But for most of a lifetime, they do their work quietly, allowing the spine to bend and twist and hold without breaking. The body learned to rest while standing, not sleep, but a kind of low alertness, a way of being present without expending more energy than necessary. Soldiers learn this. People who work on their feet for hours learn this. The ability to stand without exhaustion, to let the bones do most of the work while the muscles remain only lightly engaged. This is not laziness. This is efficiency. This is the body using the structure it has built over millions of years to hold itself upright with the least possible effort. And yet, even standing still is never truly still. Your body sways constantly, making tiny adjustments to keep your center of mass over your feet. If you stand in one place long enough, you will notice this: the slight shift of weight from one foot to the other, the small movements of your ankles and knees, and the way your hips adjust without your instruction. This is balance, but it is active balance, a constant conversation between your inner ear and your muscles, between your eyes and your feet, and between the pull of gravity and the body's refusal to fall. You inherit all of this. The ability to stand, to bear weight, to hold yourself upright without thinking about it. This is not simple. This is the result of slow changes across deep time, changes that reshaped bones and joints and muscles and nerves until they could do something no earlier body had ever done. You stand because your limbs learned, generation after generation, how to hold the weight of being human. The hand is not one thing, but many. It is 5 fingers and a thumb, 27 bones, 34 muscles, and an uncountable number of nerve endings, all working together in ways so coordinated that you rarely notice the complexity. But it was not always this way. The hand began as something far simpler: a paddle, a fin, a broad surface used for pushing through water. Over time, as bodies moved onto land, that paddle divided, separated into digits that could spread and grip and hold. The earliest fingers were clumsy. They could grasp, but only in a crude way, wrapping around a branch or a piece of food with all 5 digits at once. There was no precision, no ability to isolate one finger from the others. But even this rough grip was useful. It allowed bodies to climb, to pull themselves up into trees, and to hold onto surfaces that would otherwise be out of reach. The fingers lengthened, the bones inside them became more distinct, and slowly the hand began to develop the ability to curl and release in different ways. The thumb changed everything. Not immediately, but gradually, as the joint at its base began to rotate in a way the other fingers could not. This rotation allowed the thumb to move across the palm, to touch the tips of the other fingers, and to hold something small between the thumb and forefinger in a pinch grip. This is called opposition, and it is the foundation of almost everything the human hand can do. Without it, you could not write, could not thread a needle, and could not hold a tool with the precision needed to shape wood or stone or clay. But opposition required patience. The muscles that control the thumb are small and slow to develop. They had to learn not just strength, but control, the ability to apply just enough pressure and no more. Too much force and a small object would be crushed or dropped. Too little and it would slip away. The hand had to learn the difference between gripping and holding, between grabbing and cradling, and between force and care. The fingertips became sensitive. The skin there thickened into ridges, patterns unique to each individual, that increased friction and made it easier to hold on to smooth surfaces. Beneath that skin, nerve endings multiplied and became so densely packed that the fingertips could detect differences in texture that the eye could not see. You can feel this now if you run your fingers over a surface. The way they read roughness and smoothness, the way they sense temperature and moisture, and the way they tell you about the world through touch alone. The hand learned to work for hours without tiring, not through strength, but through endurance and the ability to shift effort between different muscles, different grips, and different angles of pressure. When you hold something lightly, like a pen or a cup, the small muscles in your hand and forearm do most of the work. When you grip something tightly, the larger muscles in your forearm and upper arm engage. The hand knows how to distribute this effort, how to switch between different kinds of holding without your conscious instruction. Repetition shaped the hand as much as evolution did. The same motion performed thousands of times, scraping a hide, sharpening a stone, weaving fibers together, created patterns of muscle memory that did not need thought to execute. The hand learned these motions so deeply that they became automatic, fluid, and almost invisible. You see this in anyone who's worked with their hands for years. The potter shaping clay, the woodworker planing a board, and the cook chopping vegetables. The hands move with a certainty that looks effortless, but is really the result of countless hours of practice, of the body learning through repetition what works and what does not. The wrist allowed this. Without the wrist's ability to rotate, to flex up and down and side to side, the hand would be far less useful. The wrist is not flashy. It does not have the complexity of the fingers or the precision of the thumb. But it positions the hand, angles it, and holds it steady or allows it to move in smooth arcs. When you write, your wrist moves the pen across the page. When you turn a doorknob, your wrist provides the rotation. When you lift something heavy, your wrist locks to keep the hand in line with the forearm, preventing injury. The hand also learned to be gentle. This is not a small thing. Strength is useful, but too much strength can be destructive. The hand had to learn to touch without harming, to hold without crushing, and to explore without breaking. This gentleness is controlled strength, the ability to apply force precisely and to stop applying it the moment it is no longer needed. You use this every day without thinking about it. When you pet an animal, when you button a shirt, when you pick up something fragile. But the hand is also capable of great force when necessary. The grip strength of the human hand is considerable, enough to hang from a branch for minutes, to hold onto a tool while striking or cutting, and to carry heavy objects without dropping them. This strength comes not just from the hand itself, but from the entire arm. The forearm muscles that control the fingers, the upper arm muscles that stabilize the elbow and shoulder, and the core muscles that support the whole structure. The hand is the end point, but it is supported by the entire body working together. The hand remembers what it has done, not consciously, but in the calluses that form where skin meets friction repeatedly, in the way certain grips feel natural because they have been performed so many times before, and in the slight ache that appears after hours of work. The body keeps track of this, adjusting the strength of tendons and ligaments, thickening skin where it is needed, and building muscle where effort is regularly applied. The hand you have now is shaped by what you have asked it to do over the course of your life. And yet, despite all this complexity, the hand is capable of stillness. It can rest completely, fingers loose and relaxed, muscles disengaged. This rest is as important as movement. It allows the hand to recover, to release the tension that builds during work, and to prepare for the next task. You see this in sleep, when the hands lie open and loose, or in moments of calm, when they rest in your lap without purpose or intention. The hand does not act alone. It is always guided by the eye, by the brain's map of space and distance, and by the sense of where the body is in relation to the world. When you reach for something, your hand already knows where it is going before it gets there. It opens to the right width, adjusts its angle, and prepares to grip. This coordination is so seamless that you only notice it when it fails, when you misjudge a distance or fumble an object. But most of the time, the hand and the eye and the brain work together so smoothly that the motion feels like one continuous thought. The human hand is not the strongest or the fastest, but it is perhaps the most adaptable. It can perform an enormous range of tasks with the same basic structure, switching from power grip to precision grip, from holding to striking, and from exploring to creating. This adaptability is the result of deep time, of countless small adjustments and refinements, of a structure that learned to do many things well rather than one thing perfectly. You carry this inheritance in every gesture, every touch, every moment, when your hand reaches out and engages with the world. The hand is patient because it had to be, because the tasks that shaped it required not just strength, but care, not just speed, but precision. It learned to wait, to work, and to hold steady when everything else was uncertain. The legs carry you forward, but they do so in a way that is unlike anything else in the body. They are not tools like the hands. They are not sensors like the eyes or ears. They are engines built for one primary task, moving the body across distance. And they do this with a kind of efficiency that is easy to overlook because it happens so automatically, so constantly, that you rarely stop to consider how remarkable it is. Walking is a controlled fall. Each step begins with a slight loss of balance as you shift your weight forward and lift one foot off the ground. For a fraction of a second, you are supported by only one leg, and the body tips forward, pulled by gravity. Then the lifted foot swings forward and lands, catching your weight before you fall. The other leg lifts, and the process repeats. This happens so smoothly that it feels like gliding, but it is really a series of tiny falls and catches, one after another, for as long as you keep moving. The legs learned to do this without wasting energy. Early walkers were inefficient. their muscles working constantly to stabilize and propel the body. But over time, the legs developed a rhythm, a pendulum-like swing that uses momentum instead of muscular effort. The leg swings forward naturally, pulled by gravity and the motion of the body, and the muscles only need to intervene slightly to guide it, to adjust the speed and placement of the step. Most of the work is done by the initial push-off, by the calf muscles and the Achilles tendon, acting like a spring that stores energy and releases it with each step. The Achilles tendon is one of the strongest structures in the body, and it is essential to walking. It connects the calf muscle to the heel bone, and it stretches and contracts with each step, absorbing force when the foot lands and releasing it when the foot pushes off. This elastic recoil saves energy, allowing you to walk for miles without exhausting the leg muscles. You do not notice it working unless it is injured, but it is active with every step you take, every stair you climb, and every time you rise up onto your toes. The hips rotate as you walk, swinging slightly forward with each step. This rotation helps lengthen your stride, allowing you to cover more ground without working harder. It also helps keep your balance, shifting your center of mass smoothly from side to side as your weight transfers from one leg to the other. This rotation is subtle, almost imperceptible, but without it walking would be stiff and awkward, requiring far more effort. The legs are built for endurance, not speed. Humans are not fast runners compared to most other animals, but they are extraordinarily good at covering long distances at a steady pace. This ability comes from the way the legs distribute effort, from the way they use tendons and ligaments to absorb and release energy, and from the way they can maintain a rhythm for hours without stopping. Early humans walked. They walked to find food, to escape danger, and to follow herds of animals across vast landscapes. They walked until the landscape itself became familiar, until the legs knew every kind of terrain and could adjust to it without thought. The muscles in the legs are layered, each group designed for a different task. The large muscles of the thigh power the leg forward, providing the force needed to push off the ground. The smaller muscles around the knee and ankle fine-tune the movement, adjusting balance and direction. The deep muscles close to the bone provide stability, holding the joints in place while the outer muscles do the work of motion. All of these muscles work together, firing in sequence, each one doing its part in a coordination so complex that it would be impossible to perform consciously. The legs also learned to carry weight, not just the weight of the body, but additional weight, tools, food, children, and materials. The ability to walk while carrying something is uniquely human in its efficiency. The legs adjust to the added mass, the stride shortens slightly, the muscles engage a little more forcefully, but the basic rhythm remains the same. You can walk for hours with a heavy pack on your back, and the legs will keep moving, keep supporting, and keep carrying you forward. But walking is not the only thing the legs learned to do. They also learned to run, to jump, to climb, to squat down low, and to rise back up. Each of these movements requires different coordination, different timing, and different kinds of strength. Running is faster but less efficient, requiring more muscular effort and more force with each impact. Jumping requires explosive power, the ability to generate force quickly enough to lift the entire body off the ground. Climbing uses the legs in combination with the arms, pushing the body upward against gravity. Squatting requires the legs to support the body's weight while folded, the joints bearing pressure at angles that walking never demands. The knees absorb enormous force. Every time you step down from a height, every time you jump and land, the knees compress and absorb the shock, preventing it from traveling up into the hips and spine. The cartilage inside the knee joint acts as a cushion, and the ligaments hold the bones together even under extreme pressure. Over time, this cartilage wears down and becomes thinner and less effective. But for most of a lifetime, the knees do their work quietly, bearing weight and force without complaint. The legs remember the places they have walked, not in any conscious way, but in the way they adjust to familiar terrain, the way they anticipate slopes and stairs, and the way they know how to move through a space you have crossed many times before. This is muscle memory, a kind of physical knowledge that does not require thought. Your legs know how to walk through your home in the dark, how to navigate a route you take every day, and how to adjust to the rhythm of the ground beneath you. And yet, the legs are also capable of stillness. Standing in one place, holding the body upright without moving, is work. But it is work the legs have learned to do with minimal effort. The muscles engage just enough to maintain balance, and the bones lock into place, supporting the weight without strain. You can stand for a long time if you need to, shifting your weight occasionally to prevent fatigue, but mostly letting the structure of the legs do the work. The legs do not tire easily, but they do tire. After hours of walking or standing, the muscles begin to ache, the joints become stiff, and the feet begin to hurt. This is the body telling you to rest, to sit or lie down, to take the weight off the legs and let them recover. Rest is essential. Without it, the legs cannot repair the small damage that accumulates with use, cannot rebuild the muscle fibers that have been strained, and cannot restore the cushioning in the joints. At night, the legs relax completely. The muscles release their tension, the joints decompress, and the legs lie still, heavy and loose. This is when recovery happens, when the body repairs itself, when the legs prepare for the next day's work. You do not notice this unless you wake suddenly and feel the weight of your legs, the way they rest against the mattress, solid and unmoving. The legs carry you through life, one step at a time. They do not hurry unless you ask them to. They do not falter unless something is wrong. They simply move, day after day, carrying the weight of your body across whatever distance you ask of them. This is endurance, not as a feat of willpower, but as a quiet capability built into the structure itself. The legs were made for this, shaped over deep time to do one thing exceptionally well: to keep moving, to keep carrying, to keep going forward. Movement is not thought. It is something deeper, something that happens before thought, faster than thought, in a part of the body that does not use language or logic, but works through rhythm and repetition, and a kind of intelligence that has no voice. When you reach for a cup, your hand does not wait for instructions. It moves. It knows the distance, the weight, and the shape of what it will grasp before it gets there. This is not magic. This is coordination, the body's way of knowing itself in space and time. The brain holds a map of the body, but it is not a map drawn with lines and labels. It is a map of sensation and possibility, of what the body can do and where it is at any given moment. This map is constantly updated and constantly revised as the body moves through the world. When you lift your arm, the map shifts. When you take a step, it adjusts. When you close your eyes, the map does not disappear. It continues, built from memory, and the sense of where your limbs are, even when you cannot see them. This sense is called proprioception, though the name is less important than what it does. Proprioception is the body's awareness of itself, the way your muscles and joints send constant signals to the brain about their position, their tension, and their angle. You do not have to look at your hand to know where it is. You do not have to think about your feet to know they are touching the ground. The body knows these things automatically, and it uses this knowledge to move without hesitation. Coordination is learned, but not in the way you learn facts or skills. It is learned through doing, through repetition, and through the body discovering what works and what does not. A child learning to walk does not understand balance or momentum, or the mechanics of how legs move. The child simply tries, falls, tries again, and slowly the body learns. The muscles learn how much force to apply. The joints learn how to position themselves. The brain learns to predict what will happen when the body shifts weight or swings a leg forward. This learning never stops. Even as an adult, the body is constantly adjusting, refining, and improving its coordination. When you walk on a new surface, your legs adapt within a few steps. When you pick up an object of unexpected weight, your arms adjust almost instantly. The body is always learning, always updating its map, and always finding new ways to move more efficiently. Rhythm is essential to coordination. Walking has a rhythm. Breathing has a rhythm. The heart beats in rhythm. These rhythms overlap and influence each other, creating a kind of internal music that the body follows without conscious effort. When you walk, your breath adjusts to match your pace. When you run, your heart speeds up, your breath quickens, and your legs move faster, all in sync. This synchronization is not forced. It emerges naturally from the body's need to work as a whole, rather than as separate parts. The arms and legs learned to work together, though they do different things. When you walk, your arms swing in opposition to your legs, the left arm forward when the right leg steps, and the right arm forward when the left leg steps. This counterbalance helps keep the body stable and prevents it from twisting with each step. You do not have to think about swinging your arms when you walk. They move on their own, following the rhythm set by the legs, contributing to the overall balance and efficiency of the motion. But the arms and legs can also move independently when needed. You can walk while carrying something, holding your arms still or using them to hold an object steady. You can stand still while your hands work, shaping or building or writing. This independence is another kind of coordination, the ability to isolate one movement from another, to keep one part of the body active while another part rests or performs a different task. The brain coordinates all of this, but it does so mostly without conscious thought. The conscious mind can intervene and can choose to move in a particular way, but most movement happens below that level, handled by older parts of the brain that do not need language or deliberation. These parts of the brain are fast. They react in milliseconds, adjust in balance, correcting errors, and preventing falls before you even realize there was a problem. This speed comes from practice. The more a movement is repeated, the more automatic it becomes, and the less the conscious mind needs to be involved. This is why walking feels effortless, why you can talk or think or look around while you walk without losing your balance or forgetting how to move. The coordination required is complex, but it has been practiced so many times that it no longer requires attention. The body also learns to anticipate. When you reach for something, your hand begins to open before it arrives. When you step onto a stair, your leg begins to lift before your foot touches the surface. This anticipation is based on experience, on the body's accumulated knowledge of how the world works and how movement unfolds over time. The brain predicts what will happen next and prepares the body to respond, shaving fractions of a second off every action. But coordination can fail. It fails when the body is tired, when the signals from muscles and joints become less clear, and when the brain's predictions are wrong. You stumble, you drop something, and you misjudge a distance. Those failures are reminders that coordination is not automatic in the sense of being guaranteed. It is automatic in the sense of being learned so deeply that it feels effortless, but it still depends on the body being awake, alert, and functioning well. The inner ear plays a role in this. Inside the inner ear are small structures filled with fluid and tiny crystals that move when the head moves. These structures detect acceleration, rotation, and the tilt of the head. They send signals to the brain about which way is up, whether the body is moving or still, and whether it is falling. This information combines with the signals from the eyes and from the muscles and joints to create a complete sense of balance and orientation. When these systems conflict, the body becomes confused. This is what happens when you spin in circles and then stop. The fluid in your inner ear is still moving, telling your brain you are still spinning, but your eyes and muscles say you are still. The brain does not know which signal to trust, and the result is dizziness, a temporary loss of coordination. But normally, these systems work together seamlessly, and you move through the world with confidence, knowing where you are and where your body is in relation to everything around you. Coordination is also social. When you hand something to another person, your hand and their hand have to arrive at the same place at the same time. When you walk with someone, you adjust your pace to match theirs without thinking about it. When you dance, you respond to another person's movements, your body coordinating not just with itself, but with theirs. This social coordination is learned too, through practice and observation, through the body's ability to read subtle cues and adjust in real time. The quiet intelligence of movement is this: the body knows more than the mind can articulate. It knows how to move through space, how to balance, and how to adjust to changing conditions. It knows this not through rules or instructions, but through lived experience, through millions of years of bodies learning to move and passing that learning down through the structure of bone and muscle and nerve. You inherit this intelligence. You use it every day without knowing it. And it works, quietly and constantly, keeping you upright, keeping you moving, and keeping you coordinated in a world that is always shifting beneath you. There are moments when the limbs are still, and yet they are not truly resting. They hold position. They maintain a posture. Even when you sit, when you lie down, or when you lean against something solid, the limbs are engaged in small ways, in adjustments and tensions that keep the body where it is, and that prevent collapse or discomfort. True rest, the kind where the limbs release all effort, is rarer than it seems. The body has preferred positions, places it returns to again and again. These are not conscious choices, but habits formed over years, over a lifetime. You cross your legs the same way every time you sit. You fold your arms in a particular pattern. You sleep on the same side, night after night. Your limbs arranged in a familiar configuration. These habits are comfortable because they are familiar, because the body has learned them so deeply that they require no thought, no adjustment. Sitting is not natural in the way standing or walking is natural. The body was not designed to sit for hours. The hips and lower back bear weight in a way they were not built for, compressed and held at angles that, over time, create stiffness and discomfort. And yet, sitting is what most people do for much of the day, and the body adapts. The muscles shorten, the joints stiffen, and the spine curves forward. This is not failure. This is the body responding to what is asked of it, even when what is asked is not ideal. The legs, when sitting, are almost idle. They bear no weight. They do little work. The muscles relax, the joints settle, and the legs rest in whatever position they are placed. But they do not rest completely. The muscles remain slightly engaged, enough to hold the position, enough to keep the legs from sliding or shifting without intention. This low-level tension is so constant that you do not notice it unless you pay attention, unless you deliberately try to relax the legs fully and discover how much effort was still being applied. The arms, when at rest, hang or fold. They are heavy, and without conscious effort, they would simply drop to the sides, pulled by gravity. But even when resting, the arms are usually held in some way, crossed or folded, or resting on a surface, and this holding requires a small amount of muscular effort. The shoulders bear the weight of the arms, and over time this can create tension, tightness, and an ache that builds so gradually you do not notice until it becomes pain. At night, the body finally releases. When you sleep, the muscles relax in a way they do not during the day. The limbs grow heavy and loose, and the body settles into the surface beneath it. This is when recovery happens, when the muscles repair themselves, when the joints decompress, and when the nervous system processes and organizes the day's experiences. Sleep is not just rest for the mind. It is essential rest for the limbs, for the body that has worked all day without stopping. But even in sleep, the limbs are not completely still. You shift position many times during the night, rolling from one side to the other, adjusting an arm or a leg, seeking comfort or relieving pressure. These movements happen mostly without waking, guided by the body's sense of what it needs, of where discomfort is building, and of when a position has been held too long. The body knows how to care for itself, even when the conscious mind is absent. Habit shapes the way the limbs age. The movements you repeat most often are the ones that stay easiest. The positions you hold most often are the ones the body defaults to. If you walk every day, walking remains easy. If you sit for years without stretching, standing becomes harder. The body adapts to what you ask of it, and it loses what you do not use. This is not punishment. This is efficiency. The body invests its resources in what it needs and lets go of what it does not. The hands, at rest, curl slightly inward. This is their natural position, the shape they take when all the muscles release. You can see this when you sleep, when your hands lie open but not flat, the fingers gently curved. This curve is built into the structure of the hand, into the tendons and ligaments that, When relaxed, pull the fingers inward just a little. It is a protective position, one that keeps the hand ready to grip if needed, even in sleep. The feet, at rest, point slightly outward. This too is natural, the result of the way the hip joint rotates when the leg is relaxed. When you lie down, your feet fall to the sides unless you consciously hold them straight. This outward rotation is comfortable because it requires no effort, no tension. The legs simply rest in the position gravity, and the structure of the joints pull them toward. Stretching is a kind of intentional rest, a way of releasing tension that has built up over hours or days. When you stretch, you are not strengthening the limbs, but reminding them of their full range of motion, of the positions they are capable of, but rarely use. Stretching feels good because it relieves the small accumulations of tightness, because it sends blood to muscles that has been held in one position too long, and because it resets the body's sense of what is comfortable. But stretching cannot undo all the effects of habit and use. The body changes over time, and some of those changes are permanent. The joints wear down, the muscles lose some of their elasticity, the tendons become less flexible. This is aging, and it is not a failure. It is the result of a body that has worked, that has moved, that has lived. The limbs carry the evidence of this work, and they continue to carry it, doing what they can with what they have. The limbs at ease are not dramatic. They do not call attention to themselves. They simply exist, heavy and warm, resting or holding, waiting for the next task or the next movement. This is most of what the limbs do. Wait. Ready but not active, present but not demanding. They are there when you need them, and they withdraw when you do not, settling into stillness until the next time they are called upon. Rest is not the absence of work. It is the body's way of preparing for more work, of recovering from what has been done, and of maintaining itself so that it can continue. The limbs rest, not because they are weak, but because rest is part of what allows them to be strong, to endure, and to keep functioning day after day, year after year. They rest so that they can move again, so that they can carry you forward when you ask them to. You did not design your limbs. You did not choose the length of your legs, or the shape of your hands, or the way your joints move. These were given to you, inherited from a chain of ancestors so long that it disappears into time beyond counting. Every bone, every muscle, every tendon carries a history that is not your own, a history that began long before there were names or language or any notion of what it meant to be human. The limbs you have are not perfect. They ache, they tire, they fail in small ways, and sometimes in large ones. But they are also extraordinary, not because they are flawless, but because they work at all. Because they carry you through the world with a competence that is easy to overlook. You walk without thinking about how walking works. You reach without calculating distance or angle. Your hands hold and shape and touch, and all of this happens so smoothly that it seems simple. But it is not simple. It is the result of deep time, of bodies adapting and changing and learning across millions of years. The decisions that shaped your limbs were not made consciously. They were made by survival, by the slow accumulation of what worked, and the gradual disappearance of what did not. The bodies that could walk farther survived. The hands that could grip more precisely made better tools. The legs that could carry weight without breaking passed that strength down to the next generation. None of this was planned, and yet it resulted in something functional, something capable of remarkable things. You carry the memory of water in your limbs, the flexibility of your wrist, the structure of your fingers, the way your shoulder rotates. All of this comes from ancestors who moved through water long before they moved on land. The limbs remember that weightlessness, that freedom of motion in 3 dimensions. Even though you've never lived in water, even though your life is bound to the ground, you carry the memory of trees in your limbs, the ability of your hands to grip, the strength of your arms to pull, the way your shoulders can bear weight when you hang or climb. All of this comes from ancestors who lived in forests, who moved through branches, who needed to hold on or fall. You do not live in trees now, but the limbs remember, and they are still shaped by that need, by that old way of being. You carry the memory of open plains in your limbs, the endurance of your legs, the efficiency of your stride, the way your body can walk for hours without stopping. All of this comes from ancestors who followed herds across vast distances, who walked to find water or food or safety. The plains are still there in the way your legs move, in the rhythm they fall into when you walk, and in the tirelessness they are capable of when asked. And you carry the memory of hands that made things, not just used things, but created them, shaped them, imagined something that did not exist, and then brought it into being through slow, patient work. Your hands are not just tools. They are the descendants of hands that held the first shaped stones, that built the first shelters, and that wove the first fibers into something useful. This capacity for making, for shaping the world, is built into the structure of your hands, into the way they can hold and manipulate and work with precision. The limbs do not know they carry this history. They simply do what they were shaped to do. They move, they hold, they carry, and they rest. They perform these tasks without reflection, without awareness, and without any sense of the long line of bodies that came before them. But the history is there, in the bones and joints and muscles, in the way everything fits together and works together, in the quiet competence of a body that has been refined across deep time. You are not separate from this history. You are part of it. Every time you walk, you are walking in a way that was learned over millions of years. Every time you reach for something, you are using a hand that was shaped by countless small adaptations. Every time you stand or sit or lie down, you are inhabiting a body that carries more knowledge than you could ever consciously hold. The limbs age. They slow down. They become stiffer, weaker, and less responsive. This is not failure. This is the natural arc of a body that has worked, that has moved, that has lived. The limbs do not last forever, but they last long enough. They carry you through childhood, through adulthood, and through old age if you are fortunate. They do not ask for thanks or recognition. They simply do their work, quietly and constantly, until they can no longer do it. And when you are still, when you lie down at night and feel the weight of your arms and legs resting against the mattress, when you notice the heaviness, the solidity, the simple fact of having a body, in that moment, you are feeling something very old. You are feeling the same weight that every ancestor felt, the same pull of gravity and the same need for rest. This is not poetic. This is physical. This is the body you inherited, doing what it has always done, what it was shaped to do across time so deep it has no edges. The limbs carry you through life without fanfare. They do not announce themselves unless something is wrong. They simply work day after day, supporting, moving, holding, and resting. They are not miraculous in the sense of being beyond understanding. They are miraculous in the sense of being exactly what they needed to be, shaped by time and use, and the slow pressure of survival into something that functions, that endures, that carries you forward. You live in a body you did not make, and yet it is yours. It responds to your intentions. It moves when you will it to move. It rests when you let it rest. This is the inheritance, not just the structure of bone and muscle, but the living experience of being in a body, of moving through the world, of existing in time and space with limbs that remember more than you know, that carry more history than you can imagine, that continue, quietly and without ceremony, to do the work they were shaped for across deep time. And now, as you settle, as the day releases its hold, the limbs rest. They grow heavy. They soften. They let go of the small tensions that accumulated through hours of use. The hands uncurl, the legs lengthen, the body sinks, held by the surface beneath it, and the limbs, for this moment, do nothing but exist, warm, present, still. This is their other work, this resting, this quiet preparation for whatever comes next. And in this stillness, in this release, they continue to carry you, even as you drift toward sleep.